Good morning. This morning, I'm going to speak to you about Acts 8:18. My title is From a Sorcerer's Perspective, Acts 8:18 and the Grammar of Hoti. Pardon me a moment. Stephen H. Levinsohn observes regarding this little Greek conjunction Hoti, certain languages have an explicit linguistic indicator of interpretive use, whose function is to signal that the utterance concerned is not a simple report of what was said on a particular occasion, but rather an interpretation or representation of an utterance or thought which it resembles. Levinsohn continues further. When Hoti occurs as a complementizer, this indicates that the propositional content of the complement is not the author's description of a state of affairs, but rather the representation of a character's thought or inference about that state of affairs. One of the reasons for choosing Hoti is when what is perceived relates back to and interprets a previous utterance. Okay, so what does this have to do with Simon the Sorcerer and his perspective? Well, we read in Acts 8:18 the following. Idon de Hosimon, Hoti dietes epitheseos ton hieron, ton apostolon, didote to pneuma, proseninkin avtis cremata. Now Simon, having perceived through the laying on of the hands of the apostles is given the Spirit, he offered them money. Again, Levinsohn has noted that when Hoti is a complementizer, that is, when it functions to make a clause complete the idea of a particular expression, it, quote, is not the author's description of a state of affairs, but rather the representation of a character's thought or inference about that state of affairs. We might, and this is general, we might signal this in English with the expression or aha. So using Levinsohn, it would then read, Acts 1:18 would then read, now Simon, having perceived, aha, through the laying on of the hands of the apostles is given the Spirit, he offered them money. This reading differs significantly from, say, the NASB. Quote, now when Simon saw that the Spirit was bestowed through the laying on of the apostles' hands, he offered them money. The NASB translates didote, present, passive, indicative, is given, in the sense of a report about what he saw, hence was given. This is understandable, since apart from Levinson's linguistic information about how Hoti functions, one would indeed normally translate a subordinate verb like didote according to the time of the verb to which it is subordinate, idon, which in turn can be viewed as subordinate to proseninkin. So the main idea would be he offered them money. The idea subordinate to the offering of money would be the perception of the situation, idon. So under normal circumstances, we would have didote subordinate to idon, subordinate to proseninkin. This would all be valid except that Hoti is not here reporting a situation, but the contents of an individual's thoughts. It functions to create, pardon me for the liberty here, taking a bit of liberty, to create a little cartoon thought bubble coming from Simon. We read Simon's thoughts, namely, through the laying on of the apostles' hands, the Spirit is given. Simon has suddenly perceived how the apostles' power works. They impart the Spirit through their hands. Consequently, he decides to offer them money to gain this imparting power for his own hands. The grammar tells us that he perceives a principle. He does not merely see an incident. But of course, the understanding of a text does not rest entirely upon grammar. We should properly ask, what is the narrative context? What's the story? Well, Peter and John have just been sent down from Jerusalem, and they have prayed for the Samaritans that they might receive the Spirit, because the Spirit had not yet fallen upon any of the Samaritans. They had only been baptized, isto onoma tu Kyriou Jesu. Then the apostles began laying hands upon the Samaritans, and they were receiving the Holy Spirit. It is at this point that we have the internal thoughts of Simon the Sorcerer shared with us. Remember that Levinsohn notes, One of the reasons, quote, one of the reasons for choosing hoti is when what is perceived relates back to and interprets a previous utterance. The previous utterance here is the narration of Luke that the apostles were laying hands upon the Samaritans and they were receiving the Spirit. Luke's presentation of his character's thought works hand in glove with his narration of the story. Luke focalizes handlaying for his readers. In fact, Luke's narrative camera focuses upon handlaying 3 times. Verse 17, the narration, verse 18, the character's thoughts, and verse 19, the character's dialogue. In this last verse, Simon eagerly expresses his wish that he might receive this exousia for his own hands. But sadly it was not to be. Peter corrects the sorcerer, not because he mistakenly thought that power could reside in his hands, since the narrator has explained already that Peter's hands are indeed powerful, but that he thought he could crassly purchase the apostolic authority with money. How then does our discussion relate back to the great interpreters of this passage? First, we note that none of them had access to Levinsohn's work. Friedrich Avemarie, whose Die Tauferzählungen der Apostelgeschichte, Theologie und Geschichte is incomparable in precision and detail, was unable to decide whether handlaying was an emergency rite used only if water baptism failed, or if it was itself an integral part of the baptismal ceremony. Jacob Jervell believed the handlaying rite to be more than merely a symbol, but the actual means of communicating the Spirit and possibly a standard part of the baptism ceremony. Yet not everyone has been so disposed as to view handlaying as the mechanism of Spirit impartation. For C.K. Barrett vociferously declares, and I quote, Luke's fundamental conviction, which is that the Spirit does not respond to certain stimuli, such as the laying on of hands, more or less in the manner of Pavlov's dog, but is given solely ubi et quando visum est Deo. It is God, not magicians or even apostles, who gives his own Spirit. Well, this brings us back to Levinsohn. And I quote Levinsohn, when hoti occurs as a complementizer, this indicates that the propositional content of the complement is not the author's description of a state of affairs, but rather the representation of a character's thought or inference about that state of affairs. One of the reasons for choosing hoti is when what is perceived relates back to and interprets a previous utterance. Levinsohn's grammatical function of hoti works smoothly with the narrative. Simon's thoughts are woven together with Luke's statements and with Simon's vocalizations. Despite the Venerable Barrett's objections, I think it is time for a rethink of Simon the Sorcerer and his perspective. If you want to read more on this topic, please pick up my book, Ritual and Religious Experience in Early Christianities, The Spirit in Between. You can find it on Amazon or on Morziebeck. Have a great day.